Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had a chance to pour more coffee or grab a snack or whatever you need to do before the final hour of our discussion today. So before we get to our final panel, I want to help provide some context for us by sharing some research. First up, research of mine, and then next of some other researchers as well. So again, I am Emily Ryder, Perlmeter. I am a senior advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas in the Research and Studies Division of Community Development. I'm responsible for quantitative research projects and outreach on issues that are relevant to low and moderate income communities. I specialize in research on consumer debt burdens and loan performance, affordable housing access, and small business resilience, with an emphasis on vulnerable communities. The title of my very short presentation today is somewhat aspirational, that we are indeed emerging from the pandemic. While we know the pandemic is still very much ongoing, but we are definitely starting to look forward. I'm going to share some housing-related data from a Texas perspective that I hope will be useful in giving us some understanding of where we are now before we jump into the panel. Importantly, you should know that anything I say here today represents my own views and does not necessarily reflect any position of the Dallas Fed or the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so up first, I'm going to talk to you about the situation for homeowners with mortgages across our communities in Texas. A lot of these data that I'm going to present are from research I'm currently doing on mortgage performance during and after the pandemic. The research relies on several data sources, the first of which is from Equifax, which is one of our three main credit reporting agencies or credit bureaus in this country. So this is a chart using Equifax data. And what you're looking at is the share of mortgages that are at least 30 days past due in both Texas and the US. So Texas is the green line and the US line is blue. This chart starts in December of 2019, and we can see that in the early months of the pandemic, as a record number of Americans lost their jobs, including 1.4 million Texans, something unusual happened in terms of delinquent mortgages. The rate of delinquencies, or the share of loans that were at least 30 days, dropped. And it wasn't a small drop either. So this chart expands the timeline back to 2015, and you can see that we were on a trend downward, but that the rate of change is much larger starting in April and May of 2020 than the previous declining trend. This is what I might call a plummet even in the share of payments that are late. And this was at a time when people were losing their jobs at a rapid rate. But let's take a look at this from the mortgage servicer perspective. So this chart uses the same time period as the previous one, but we're going to use a different data source here. This data source aggregates reports from the mortgage servicers. So what we see here in both Texas and the US is a massive jump for the mortgage payments that are past due. So what does this mean? Well, as we discussed earlier, this is showing you the impact of policy. It is showing you again, as we discussed with Dr. Desmond and Dr. Henry Nicky, that the CARES Act did have a drastic impact on what otherwise could have been skyrocketing delinquencies that were reported to credit bureaus. So these economic supports that came from the CARES Act reflected in this chart, of course, are primarily mortgage forbearance provisions. So the picture for mortgage servicers that you see here is obviously a lot different than the picture reported to Equifax. We know that forbearance is swiftly ending on a staggered basis, and those accounts are now becoming due. So as mortgages exit the forbearance period, what does it look like across our state? The most recent data shown here happens to be from August, and it shows that the rates vary pretty drastically across Texas. Some communities, this by the way is on a zip code level, some communities show very low delinquency rates of 1 or 2%, and that's shown in that very light yellow color, but others have a lot more, 10%, 15% of their mortgages are past due. It's a bit hard to really see too much on this map right here. So I'm going to zoom in for you on a select few MSAs. And for those familiar with the geography in those MSAs, you may be able to notice some patterns in terms of income and race and the correlation with delinquency rates. So this is the Austin, Round Rock, San Marcos area. And this is an area that has some of the lowest levels of mortgage delinquencies. But you can still see, if you look very, very clearly, that the Eastern Crescent down through Bastrop and Caldwell counties are still struggling a bit more than the much higher income areas off to the western side of Travis County. In DFW, we see a little bit more of a mixed bag. So some areas of Tarrant County do appear to be struggling, as well as a large portion of the southern part of Dallas County. And in Houston, Sugar Land-Baytown, we can see evidence of a lot more difficulty. You can see the dark blue pattern towards the eastern part of Harris County by East Houston, the 5th Ward, and Northeast Houston. That represents higher rates of delinquent mortgages. For El Paso, as well as the McAllen MSA, there are fewer zip codes and just overall less variation. But we can definitely tell that there's a lot more dark green, teal, and dark blue, indicating those higher rates of mortgage delinquencies. So we talked about delinquencies, but we haven't talked about those who opted in for mortgage forbearance, and what does that look like? So there's definitely some evidence that homeowners have used forbearance as an insurance policy, meaning that even if they were not experiencing financial hardship at the time that the forbearance provision was given out, that some opted into forbearance to insure against anything that might happen down the line. So for this reason, forbearance is not going to be a perfect measure of households that are actually in distress, because for some who use the provision as insurance, they may not have ended up having financial difficulties and they remained current on their mortgages. But as time forbearance opportunities have ended or they are ending, the share of mortgage holding households that are still in forbearance can indicate some degree of concern as those mortgages become due. So what you're seeing here is a map on a zip code level of the share of mortgages in forbearance. Now, you'll see a lot of white on this map, and that just indicates we don't simply have enough data for those regions. But you'll notice this is also from April. It's just because of the data lag for this particular data source. I can't zoom in, unfortunately, much more than this, but you can get an idea of those areas that are shaded more darkly. They represent areas of greater concern. It's also important to note that areas with high rates of forbearance in some cases are the same areas that we saw higher rates of mortgage delinquencies. And beyond this, race and income seem to be correlated with forbearance outstanding and the share of loans past due. So for example, the purple chart at the top here indicates the share of people of color, and the green and red one indicates the low and moderate income share. It's easier to see on the bottom chart just because of the colors and the shading, to see the correlation between the delinquencies and forbearance with the higher share of low and moderate income households in that particular neighborhood. It's not certainly some sort of perfect one-to-one correlation, but there's certainly a moderate association between these variables. And we know that those who are struggling with mortgage payments certainly has a disproportionate impact for communities of color and for LMI households. So many of the reasons why are systemic and really require a thoughtful focus on populations disproportionately affected, not just a broad blanket approach to mortgages. So now let's turn to the picture for individuals and families that rent. I'll be using a few different data sources for this part. I have not worked as extensively in renter and eviction data, but I still think it's important to bring this to the table to set some context for the panel coming up. So eviction and rent data can be less robust and it's just less standardized than on the mortgage side. It's just not as easy to collect and report the data. However, fortunately, sources like Eviction Lab have been doing an incredible job gathering data for their eviction tracking system. And so I'm going to start off with a brief look at their information. So this is what things have looked like since the start of the pandemic. Here's a table from Eviction Lab indicating the most filings since the start of the pandemic. We can see that Texas has 3 cities in the top 6 in the country, the top cities at least for which they have data. As I just mentioned, it's not that easy to collect data on evictions, and it really depends on the infrastructure for reporting that a city or a state has. For those who may be hunting for Austin on this list, it's actually way down at the very bottom. And I would say that has certainly a lot to do with population size, but it also has to do with some of the local protections that Austin has offered through October that are really quite different compared to Houston, Dallas, or Fort Worth. We're going to zero in on Houston for a moment. It's our largest city in our state and also one of the top 3 cities in terms of evictions. Because of some of the eviction moratoriums and some of the economic supports available during the pandemic, we can see evidence that the rate of evictions did drop quite a bit below average. But since protections have expired, we really see that increase. And in fact, Houston is one of the cities where eviction rates surpass right now their average filings starting in October. So this doesn't paint a picture that we have solved anything here. We've just put a Band-Aid over the issue. But with the expiration of many of the benefits from the pandemic, we're going to be in a tough spot regarding stability of tenant households. The reality is that renters in this country and Texas are still struggling. And in fact, while 1 in 6 Americans reports not being caught up on rent, the ratio is more than 1 in 5 for Texans. And the data are quite current here from September and October. They come from the Census Household Pulse Survey. This is the survey the census began at the start of the pandemic. So we can certainly see indications that the size of the problem and how Texas compares nationally, we see despite economic prosperity in many parts of our state, more than 20% of our population indicates struggling with rent in September or October. Beyond rent, we also see a large portion of households reporting difficulty covering expenses more broadly. So this chart is also from the Household Pulse Survey, and the subject is normal expenses or usual expenses. And those are things like food, car payments, mortgage, rent, student loans. Texas has almost a third of households that are struggling to cover their expenses, while other states have far lower shares. So what does all this mean? Well, some parts of the picture are still very unclear. We know pandemic economic relief, whether in the form of stimulus, expanded unemployment benefits, rental assistance, moratoriums, it all made a difference, right? So research across the board pretty much indicates that the counterfactual, where we didn't have those supports, would mean that poverty and homelessness and material hardship overall would have risen much more. However, they were not meant to be long-term, right? So that's why I called them Band-Aids. And we're not like all of a sudden in a better place than we were before. The mortgage picture does remain a bit unclear. We don't have all the data for homeowners. We do see indications that some geographic areas are struggling more than others. We also see that tenants in Texas report higher rates of difficulties catching up on rent. And cities like Houston have eviction rates that have rebounded from pandemic lows. So this is not the best picture, but the reality is that we can try to learn from the past year and a half, and that's what we're going to talk about in our next and final conversation today. So I encourage all of you to think about the work that you all do and reflect on how things have been going since 2020, and maybe see this as an opportunity to think through how to reallocate or guide resources. Again, thank you for being with me today. Here's my email in case you would like to connect or engage. And I'd also invite you to explore some of our resources at dallasfed.org. You can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, or Facebook. Our success frequently just depends on connecting with people in the communities we serve, so please stay engaged with us. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, hopefully. All right, so it is now my pleasure to introduce our panel of practitioners, our final session of the day. We have 3 expert panelists representing different cities and states. So we have Andrea Bell, Director of Housing Stabilization at Oregon Housing and Community Services. We also have Rodney Fong, President and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce and co-chair of the San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force. And Jackie Robinson, who is Interim President and CFO for New Jersey Community Capital, which is New Jersey's largest CDFI. The discussion will be moderated by Nicole Farini, who is Chief Resilience Officer and Director of Community and Human Development for the City of El Paso. In a moment, you should see an invitation to join that session and meet Nicole and the panelists. So please click on it, and we hope that you enjoy.